Hello, everyone, and welcome to FIRST's 2021 Cyber Threat Intelligence Special Interest Group Virtual Summit. I am Brandon Levene, Crimeware Inquisitor for Google Cloud's Uppercase team. Today, we're going to break down how cybercriminals have adapted and matured their operations towards a loose reflection of economic specialization. So let's first take a high-level view at the overall thesis of this discussion. The world of cybercrime has evolved beyond the single bad guy into an organized operation complete with role specialization and is increasingly focused on effective tactics for maximizing ROI. I implore everyone to internalize and think over the ramifications of this point and encourage further dialogue in the conference Slack channel. One of the most important messages that I wish to convey today, although we all intrinsically realize this, is that modern business, and maybe not so modern ones, are dependent on data. Let's take a look at the Russian CIS cybercrime layout, as that is by far the most mature cybercrime region at this time. The images shown here were published by CrowdStrike in 2021 and in 2020 and 2021 as lookbacks at the prior year, respectively, 2019 and 2020. I really like these summary pictures, as they demonstrate the scale, scope, and interconnectedness of cybercrime operations. Astute viewers may notice that there are very few isolated nodes, and this gives us an inkling that of the fluidity of the way that these groups operate. Overall, we can see an interesting facet of Russian Nexus cybercrime, and as a microcosm of cybercrime in general, the community does not generally operate in an isolated manner. What may be perceived as competitors one day can be partners the next. This fluidity was in further evidence throughout 2020 as groups consolidated activity towards human-operated ransomware campaigns. This can be seen in the increased overlap between what many consider distinct threat actors. Hopefully everyone's brains are churning now. Let's briefly discuss where cybercrime traditionally found itself in terms of roles versus the reality of 2021. Back in the heyday of cybercrime, it was much more common for an individual, very small group, to run the full spectrum of a criminal operations. This included everything from hosting, malware development and procurement, distribution, and monetization. On the whole, this really isn't the case anymore, with some exceptions. As enterprises have become increasingly viable targets for cybercrime groups, operations have scaled up out of necessity. Attackers target public and private sector organizations, schools, and businesses globally rather than individual computers. Why pocket $300 per attack when you can pocket $500K, $1 million, $20 million, $50 million? Capabilities of nation states and cybercrime commodity threat actors have converged in the last 3 years. In many cases, their tooling and tactics are similar. Threat actors learn from each other, even if it is indirect. Note that while the one-man band or the very small group of operators is less common now, it still certainly exists, and we can see this in cybercrime, the cybercrime environment of, say, South America and other regions. But this is generally when we look at the cutting edge of cybercrime, like we do, like in this case for Russian or CIS Nexus, it is becoming increasingly uncommon to see a singular threat actor or a small group versus a conglomerate or a fluid organization operating. So if the one-man band of cybercrime is antiquated, where does that leave us now? Highly effective cybercrime operations encompass skilled individuals or teams that fill specific niches. Each niche is critical to the overall success of the entire enterprise and thus share portions of the generated net revenue. This diagram presents a high-level overview of the logical subdivisions one is likely to find when looking just a little closer at any given cybercriminal enterprise. At a high level, we can roughly divide the specializations into 4 distinct categories. Top left, we have distributors. These are responsible for creating reach, victim, contact, and interaction for threat actors. The top right, breach and access specialists. These provide access and target orientation. Lateral movement, deep recon, and initial exfiltration are essentially tasks of intrusion operations. And finally, in the bottom right, we have monetization. These are the tools to elicit payment and handle negotiations and ultimately resolution. Not pictured, although likely a subcategory of monetization as a whole, is the overall concept of money laundering, which we're not going to get into. Let's take a closer look at these four categories of specialization. The first specialized role we will discuss is that of the distributor. Creating reach. And reach in this context is the ability to expose targets to an attacker, lure, or payload. Think of it like impressions if you were running ads. If you can't get your payload in front of anyone, no matter how good it is, you aren't going to make any money because your payload's never going to land anywhere. A good example of this in the recent year is Emotet, which could potentially reach upwards of 500,000 individuals a day. This is an example of what I would say is high reach. Low reach is typically considered in the 10,000 or below, though that is entirely subjective, as you could have low reach, but it is targeting a very specific region. Thus, you could have a relatively high impact, even though you are only hitting a smaller number of individuals. The primary way to create reach is via email. Exploit kits are still around, but are either very regionally specific. Specifically, we see this in Japan, other APAC regions like South Korea, or they're just poorly maintained. So email lures are the most popular point of interface between attacker and victim. Office documents remain incredibly popular. There has been a decided shift away from exploits towards macros and VBS, and a massive uptick in actually malicious Excel formatted documents of various types versus the traditional document or .doc type of files. One trend has surfaced in 21 is the need for multiple independent distribution vectors. This is best exemplified by the threat actors controlling TrickBot, who use multiple discrete affiliates and track their delivery efficacy via infection rate. This is something that you actually see via GTAGs. It's interesting that this trend has come to fore in 2021, and you really saw this a bit throughout 2020. But with the takedown of the juggernaut of Emotet in early 2021, you have seen this independent distribution vectors, 4 or 5 different ways of distribution, all via email, but via different hosters or different providers, really come to the fore. You see this with QuackBot, you see this with TrickBot, and the like. Infrastructure such as staging, web hosts, initial callback, or tier 1 is increasingly falling under the services offered by distributors. This is a market departure from the past where infra had to be provided to distributors in many cases. Now that we have an idea of how distribution works and its place in the greater scheme of cybercrime, let's take a closer look at how initial access has evolved. The heaviest investments by threat actors are aimed at increasing the odds of landing on target. This can be logically split into 2 additional subcategories. The delivery vehicle, which facilitates the execution of the initial implant or payload. Think the actual malware doc or the VBS or the MSHTA load process, and then that initial implant or payload. So you've got like a Hanserhor DLL or a Dridex DLL or a TrickBot executable. Delivery vehicles such as password-protected zip files or macro-laden Excel docs are sourced by distributors on behalf of the traditional threat actors, such as those behind QuackBot, TrickBot, BotBot, etc. Executable and implant payloads are provided to the distributors, who are also responsible for seeding infrastructure to host the payloads for retrieval. Threat actors know if you fail to detect them on landing, your chances of ever getting them are incredibly low. With the increased targeting of enterprises by cybercrime threat actors, there's been an increase in a capability I'd call orientation. This effectively means that the threat actors invest heavily into understanding who the victims are and where their payload has landed. This activity is generally automated with a few simple Windows commands. One of the most important findings in recent times is that threat actors change their behaviors based on the presence of Active Directory, specifically within a victim network. Positive identification of an AD environment connected to a victim is a good indicator that the payload has landed in a potentially lucrative professional environment, and additional payloads are likely to be delivered at this point. But how do cyber criminals turn access into action? Let's talk about professional intruders. Access and orientation to a target is only the start of the long journey to converting an operation into tangible revenue. Post-intrusion activity by threat actors is indistinguishable from a commercial red team engagement. The difference, of course, is objective. Intrusion services are generally assigned a particular target or set of targets that have been deemed lucrative after a successful initial breach. Their role is expansion of access and identification of vital assets. Many intruders appear to function as contractors and likely receive a percentage of payout as a fee. They are different personnel than distributors and malware authors and fulfill the specific hands-on keyboard niche that many red teamers may find familiar. In many investigations, intruders have made heavy reliance on open source tooling. This is not only expected, but an intelligent practice in terms of 1, muddying attribution, and 2, maximizing an investment first time. Intruders work closely with ransomware operators to stage and distribute payloads for maximum impact. Now that an intrusion crew has teed up a payload that will generate revenue, such as ransomware, what happens next? Bad guys have reached a target, they've secured access, they've determined the target is worthwhile, and they have carte blanche access to the target's network. Time to call on the moneymakers, which is at this point in time the ransomware operators, and this has held true roughly for the last 3 or so years. Though we do see crews that have held out on the banking component really have caved into the ransomware operation. Ransomware operators partner with intrusion crews to facilitate ransomware deployment. They typically either obtain payloads from ransomware as a service providers, such as the now defunct Maze or Egregor, and then the now active Revil again, or develop their own exclusive offerings in close partnership with threat actors like we see with Conti and Wizard Spider, aka the TrickBot main group. Ransomware operators handle all aspects of customer interactions, although they may outsource things like customer service and portal management and the like. This includes initial contact, negotiations, payment, decryption and/or resolution, and leaks if applicable in the case of failed payment. This niche is a conversion of access to cash and is the most effective method of realizing financial gains for threat actors that we have seen to date. Let's put everything back together so we can walk away with an understanding of what this all actually means in practice and why we need to sort of adjust our threat models when we consider cybercrime as a whole, and especially when we consider acting against cybercriminal actors. For financially motivated threat actors, unfortunately, business is booming. Specialization leads to resiliency. The distribution of roles reduces operational risk. You can see this in the case of where Emotet went down, but that didn't impact the things like TrickBot or QuackBot's abilities to land on target. Though reach has overall decreased, they are still able to make money because their specific roles are distributed. Fulfilling specific niches allows for more effective, larger efforts. So if you have multiple distributors, you can ultimately compensate for the lack of a singular actor with tremendous reach by sort of creating these smaller sets that additive have at least equitable reach to a larger threat actor. The outcome of cybercrime operations has increased. The average ransomware payment, according to Coveware, is about $230,000. The highest known ransom to date is about $50 million. This was against Acer just last month, I think March of 2021. One interesting side effect of cyber insurance is that this is actually a low-hanging fruit. You can see this with CNA, who got hit. And we can see this through various interviews that have been posted from ransomware threat actors that say, hey, if we know a target has cyber insurance, we will prioritize them because we know they are more likely to pay. This is an interesting side effect of the rise in cyber insurance is a discernible risk when considering who to go with as a provider and how public you are about that capability. One of the biggest things I really want to drive home, and one of the biggest takeaways here, is tools are not their threat actors. The key takeaway is that the initial payload, be it TrickBot, QuackBot, ICID, Hansator, is purely a means to an end. They are not the end goal themselves. The most important outcome for a threat actor or cyber criminal at this stage is to establish reliable access and a target profile. An attribution must consider the entire ecosystem in which cybercrime operates and its interconnected nature and account for the objectives of these crews. Group boundaries are incredibly nebulous, as you may recall from the multiple CrowdStrike summaries that we showed very early on today. And those boundaries being nebulous makes it very difficult to combat these things at a legal level and at an enforcement level, because you knock out one part of the operation without compensating for the others, then you will quickly leave either a power vacuum or not even that. It will just be a quick recovery as, say, Egregor went down and immediately threat actors moved to Revil. What's the ultimate impact here? Very little. The complexity of compromise is increasing. Attackers are successful, but there are huge opportunities for detection in depth. Oops. Let's go back. And actually, that is the end of everything. If there are any questions, comments, or concerns, please post them in the Slack channel. I'm on Twitter at Seraphim Domain. I'm on LinkedIn at MB Levene. Don't make it terribly difficult to find me. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.